Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here, we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams. Harlem, late 1960s. The night is not silent, but it holds a strange kind of stillness, a rhythm that seems to breathe with the streets themselves. On Lenox Avenue, a saxophone weeps from the open door of a jazz club, its melody curling like smoke into the cold winter air. Laughter drifts from a corner diner, mixed with the clink of glasses and the steady hum of conversations. Neon signs flicker, bathing the pavement in restless shades of pink and green. The city is alive, yet beneath it all, there is a heaviness, an unspoken tension that lingers in the shadows. On this night, Harlem waits, though it doesn't know for what. A man steps out from the curb, his polished shoes tapping softly against the wet pavement. His movements are deliberate, precise, like the pacing of a predator who has studied every angle of his environment. He is not tall in the way that demands attention, nor loud in the way that draws a crowd. Instead, his presence carries a quiet weight, the kind of gravity that makes others shift slightly, as though instinctively aware that someone of consequence has entered their space. Frank Lucas, at this moment, he is not yet a legend. Not yet the man who will flood Harlem with a river of pure heroin. Not yet the name whispered in both fear and admiration. Tonight, he is something else, entirely a man on the edge of transformation. He is disciplined, watchful, and above all, patient. The air is sharp with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt, of roasted chestnuts sold from a street cart, of cigarette smoke trailing from doorways. Around him, Harlem carries on as it always has. Young men in long coats cluster beneath the glow of street lamps, their voices quick and restless. A woman in a fur stole hurries past, clutching her purse close against her side. Children press their faces against fogged windows, watching the world move while they remain still. It is a neighborhood both alive and aching, a place where dreams rise quickly and fall faster still. Harlem, in these years, is a theater of contradictions. Music and sorrow, hope and despair, celebration and mourning. And into this theater, Frank Lucas steps quietly, carrying within him the ghosts of poverty and the hunger of ambition. He was born far from here, in the red clay fields of North Carolina, where the world seemed smaller, and opportunity was something spoken of in stories but rarely seen. His childhood was marked not by abundance but by absence. The absence of money, of power, of protection. He grew up watching his family bend beneath the weight of need, and in that crucible, something hardened in him. A refusal to be small. A vow that he would not die forgotten in the dirt. Now, years later, that vow has brought him to Harlem, where every neon flicker feels like a challenge, every alley a test. He has already learned enough to know that success here does not favor the reckless. Harlem does not reward noise. It rewards discipline, control, patience, and those he has in abundance. He moves through the night with the careful detachment of a man who observes more than he speaks. He notices the subtle signals others miss. The way a dealer hides his product in the hollow of a newspaper stand. The nervous glance exchanged between a gambler and his watchman. The quick movement of a hand to a pocket when strangers approach. These details, invisible to most, are lessons to Lucas. They are the invisible architecture of Harlem's underground life, and he is determined to master it. Yet there is something more beneath his calm exterior, current of hunger, deep and relentless. Poverty has left him with scars that do not show, but that guide every decision. He knows what it means to go without, to feel powerless in a world that takes and takes. And so, his ambition is not casual. It is survival transfigured into fire. Tonight, Harlem does not know him, not truly. To most, he is just another figure moving through the crowd. But in his own mind, Lucas already carries the outline of an empire. Not in its details, not yet, but in its certainty. He believes, with the quiet ferocity of faith, that he is destined to rise. The wind picks up, scattering scraps of newspaper along the gutter. The headlines speak of war in Vietnam, of political unrest, of marches and protests, and the aching fight for equality. Harlem itself is both a witness and a battlefield in these struggles. The people walk with resilience, yet their eyes often hold the fatigue of battles not yet won. It is here, in this crucible of struggle and survival, that Lucas will carve his name. He pauses at a corner, leaning slightly against a lamppost, watching the traffic crawl by. His face, in the flickering neon light, is unreadable. To those who glance his way, he seems merely another man biding his time. But within, thoughts are moving like chess pieces, calculations, strategies, the slow weaving of plans. This chapter of his life is not yet about power or riches. It is about preparation, about the silence before the storm. He understands something that many of his peers do not, that patience is as dangerous as violence, that discipline can conquer chaos somewhere down the block. A fight breaks out, voices raised, the sudden shatter of a bottle, the swift scramble of feet on pavement. People turn their heads, momentarily distracted, but Lucas does not move. He watches, not with curiosity, but with recognition. He knows that chaos consumes those who cannot control it, and he knows, too, that he will never allow himself to be one of them. The night stretches on, carrying with it the layered sounds of Harlem, the distant rumble of trains, the laughter that fades into sorrow, the saxophone still crying in the club. To walk these streets is to feel history pressing close, to sense both the beauty and the weight of a community built on resilience. As Lucas continues his slow walk, the city seems to breathe with him. The neon, the music, the murmured conversations, all of it feels like a stage, and he, a man stepping into his role. The performance has not yet begun, but the audience is gathering, even if they do not yet know his name. For now, Harlem holds its breath. It waits in the stillness of its own contradictions, not knowing that within its crowded streets, a quiet predator is preparing to change everything. Frank Lucas, the son of poverty, the student of discipline, the man with a vision that burns in silence, he is here. And though the night seems ordinary, the world has already begun to shift. Before Harlem, before the glitter of neon signs and the intoxicating hum of jazz, there was the quiet red earth of North Carolina. To understand Frank Lucas, to understand the man he became, one must first walk barefoot through the soil that shaped him. That soil was not rich with promise. It was not the kind that yielded wealth or ease. It was stubborn earth, red clay that clung to the soles of shoes, as if to remind its people that nothing would come without struggle. Frank was born in 1930, into a family that had little and expected little. The Great Depression had left its scars not only on the nation, but on every wooden porch and weather-beaten farmhouse in the Carolinas. In his earliest memories, the world was a patchwork of scarcity, tobacco fields stretching wide, the acrid smoke of curing barns rising into the air, and a long, hollow whistle of trains that passed through town but rarely stopped. The trains were a sound of escape, a reminder that there was a larger world beyond the clay roads and cracked tin roofs. The Lucas household was crowded, a place where survival meant stretching whatever food could be gathered. Cornbread, beans, and hand-me-downs became the language of his childhood. His mother, with hands calloused from work, carried the quiet strength of someone who had long accepted hardship as an uninvited guest. His father, when present, stood as a figure both fragile and stern, worn down by labor and circumstance. Poverty was not simply a condition. It was the air that filled their lungs, the dust that settled on their clothes, the silence that pressed in when night fell and there was little to eat. And yet, even in this scarcity, Frank's mind reached outward. He noticed things. He studied people. As a boy, he would watch the way certain men walked into town, men who were not necessarily wealthy, but who commanded respect, men who could walk into a room and silence it with their presence. Some were preachers, others were local bosses, men who had carved a small power from land and reputation. Frank saw the way others deferred to them, and he tucked those observations away. Respect, he learned early, was a currency far more valuable than the few coins his family managed to keep. But in the South of his youth, respect was a fragile thing. Frank grew up under the shadow of racism, a system that reminded him at every turn what he could not be. Signs on shop doors, insults hurled casually in the streets, the way white boys could dream aloud of futures while he was told to keep his eyes lowered. These encounters left marks that were invisible yet permanent. The lesson was clear. The world was not designed for him to rise. If he wanted to change that, he would need to bend its rules, perhaps even break them. The fields were his first classroom. Long days under a punishing sun taught him endurance. The scent of soil and sweat became familiar, the sound of cicadas rising and falling in endless chorus marking the hours. There was something meditative in the rhythm of labor, but also something suffocating. As he bent his back in the rows, his mind wandered. He imagined cities he had never seen. He dreamed of suits, cars and rooms where his name would be spoken with either admiration or fear, anything but dismissal. And then there were the trains. They fascinated him more than anything else. He would stand by the tracks, feeling the ground tremble as locomotives thundered past, their carriages filled with people going somewhere he could not yet reach. In those moments, the boy became both spectator and dreamer. The train symbolized everything he craved: motion, escape, destiny. They whispered promises of a life far removed from the red clay that clung stubbornly to his shoes. But before escape, there was humiliation. One memory, sharp and unyielding, followed him into adulthood. As a boy, he once tried to purchase food at a local store, only to be mocked and shoved aside, treated as if his presence itself was an intrusion. The laughter of others burned deeper than hunger, and in that humiliation a seed was planted. It was not merely about money. It was about never again feeling small, never again being looked at as if he did not belong. That quiet fury, born of small-town injustice, would harden into the steel of ambition. Life in North Carolina shaped Frank into someone disciplined. He understood that showing vulnerability was dangerous. Poverty had taught him to wear composure like armor. While other children might cry openly or lash out, Frank learned to watch, to measure, to hold his emotions until the time was right. Discipline was not yet ambition, but it was its necessary companion. Still, beneath the stillness was hunger, not the hunger of empty plates, but of an unquiet spirit. Rural life offered safety in its routines, yet Frank longed for more. He felt it when he stood at the edge of fields that stretched farther than his young eyes could follow. And he felt it when the night sky unfolded in endless constellations. The stars reminded him that there was more to existence than his small town, more than the clay, more than the insults, more than the limits imposed upon him. The irony was that the very hardships designed to confine him also sharpened him. In the unrelenting sun, he learned patience. In the cruelty of others, he learned silence. In poverty, he discovered the value of desire without realizing it. The boy was being carved into someone who would one day command a stage far larger than his hometown could imagine. But he was not yet that man. He was still just a boy, standing on the edge of a dusty road, listening to the whistle of another train. He could feel the future pressing against him, restless, insistent, like a tide waiting to break. North Carolina had given him roots in red clay that could hold him or haunt him, but deep inside, Frank Lucas already knew he would not remain there. For now, though he waited, and waiting can be as powerful as moving. In silence, ambition grows. In silence, destinies take shape. And one day, soon, silence would no longer be enough. Harlem did not welcome newcomers gently. It swallowed them whole, tested their patience, and demanded that they either adapt to its rhythm or vanish into obscurity. For a young man like Frank Lucas, fresh from the soil of North Carolina, the place was nothing short of a revelation. The first thing he noticed was the sound. Harlem was never silent. Streetcars clanged along their tracks, horns blared from traffic that moved in fits and starts, and radios poured music out of open windows, each voice competing with the next. By day the sidewalks belonged to hustlers and preachers, vendors calling out their wares, children skipping rope in chalk-marked squares. By night, Harlem was transformed into a different kind of theater. Neon lights flickered to life, bathing the avenues in a restless glow. Doors to jazz clubs swung open, letting bursts of brass and rhythm spill into the streets before closing again like secrets being whispered. There was heat in the air, even in winter, a heat born not from the weather, but from the sheer density of ambition, survival, and hunger that pulsed in every block. For Frank, this was not just a neighborhood. It was a baptism. The red clay dust of his childhood seemed to fall away with each step he took. He was no longer just the boy who had been overlooked and humiliated in the South. Here, he had the chance to become someone new. But Harlem was not simply alive. It was watchful. Power had its eyes everywhere. To move carelessly was to court disaster, and Frank learned quickly that every gesture, every glance, every word spoken in public was observed and measured. Harlem's underworld was not an open door. It was a maze of locked rooms, and the keys were held by a select few. Among those few, none loomed larger than Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was not loud, not brash, not the kind of man who wasted energy on proving what everyone already knew. His reputation filled the streets, long before his footsteps ever did. In him, Frank saw a model of something he had never known back home. The kind of authority that did not ask permission. Bumpy walked into a room and silence followed. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, men listened as if scripture had been delivered. Their first encounters were not dramatic. There was no sudden proclamation of mentorship, no cinematic handshake that sealed their bond. Instead, there were moments of quiet observation. Frank standing at the edges of crowded rooms, watching how Bumpy conducted business with the same patience one might use to study a chessboard. He noticed the way Bumpy never raised his voice, yet never needed to. He noticed the pause before a command, the weight behind a single word, the subtle pressure that bent men to his will without visible force. Frank learned that Harlem's power was not always in what was shown, but in what was withheld. Silence could be more dangerous than threats, patience more intimidating than fury. Bumpy was, in many ways, Harlem itself, dangerous, alluring, filled with contradictions. He was both feared and respected, hated and admired. On one side of the street he was a criminal, on the other a benefactor who provided food, protection, and a sense of belonging. To the police he was a target. To his community he was a shield. This duality fascinated Frank. It taught him that legitimacy and corruption were not opposites but neighbors, often indistinguishable from one another in the right light. Harlem molded him slowly. It was in the long nights spent standing outside clubs, inhaling the mixture of cigarette smoke and perfume that clung to the air. It was in the early mornings when he walked the streets after the music had faded. The sidewalks littered with bottles and scraps of newspaper, the residue of dreams and disappointments. It was in the quiet corners of back rooms where men counted money with careful precision, their whispers more binding than contracts. Frank absorbed it all. He kept his head down, his ears open, his words measured. In a place where arrogance could draw bullets and carelessness could end a life, discipline became his armor. He learned to move without announcing himself, to listen more than he spoke, to let others underestimate him. The Harlem of the 1940s and 1950s was not a playground for the weak. It was a place that demanded performance on the streets, in the clubs, in the parlors where deals were struck. To survive was one thing, to rise was another. Frank saw both paths clearly. The first led to obscurity, a life spent scraping by, no better than what he had left behind. The second led to power, and with power came the respect he had long hungered for. Yet even as Harlem revealed its promise, it also revealed its dangers. Police whistles cut through the night, sudden and shrill, reminders that the law was always near, always watching. Raids were swift and merciless, designed not only to punish but to humiliate. Rivalries between men with too much pride and too little patience flared like sudden fires, ending in blood that stained the very sidewalks Frank walked upon. Still, he remained steady. Each risk, each loss he witnessed only sharpened his awareness. Harlem was teaching him its most sacred lesson. Power was not about violence alone. It was about perception, about how others believed you might act even before you did. There were nights when Frank stood outside the Apollo Theater, watching the crowd spill out after a performance. Laughter, music, and applause filled the street, as if for a moment the struggles of life could be drowned out. He felt a strange kinship with the performers. They had rehearsed their art, perfected their presence, and stepped into the light to command attention. He, too, was rehearsing, though his stage was hidden, his audience far less forgiving. Harlem baptized him not with water, but with noise, with light, with the unrelenting push of survival. It was here that Frank shed his boyhood skin. It was here he began to understand that ambition was not a spark, but a slow-burning flame, one that required constant tending, and always. In the background there was Bumpy, watching, guiding in ways that were not always visible. Each glance, each word, each silence from him was a lesson, one that Frank carried with the gravity of scripture. By the time he truly stepped into Harlem's inner world, he was no longer just a boy from North Carolina. He was something else, still unformed, still waiting, but tempered by the fire of a city that demanded transformation. The baptism was not yet complete, but the water had closed over his head. When he rose, gasping, it would be as someone the streets of Harlem could no longer ignore. It did not happen all at once. There was no sudden eruption of wealth, no moment when Harlem awoke to see Frank Lucas sitting on a throne. His empire, unlike the wild fables whispered about other gangsters, was not born in neon light or deafening gunfire. It was something slower, more deliberate, like the quiet growth of roots beneath soil, spreading unseen until the tree above seemed immovable. Frank had learned something crucial during his apprenticeship under Bumpy Johnson, the art of invisibility. Harlem adored its loud, flamboyant figures. Men who stepped out in fur coats, who parked Cadillacs along curbs like trophies, who measured their power in the noise they could make. But Frank understood that noise was only another form of weakness. The louder you announced yourself, the easier you were to find, and the shorter your reign became. He would be different. He would build something that thrived not in spectacle but in silence. It began with observation. Harlem's heroin trade, as Frank inherited it, was a web of hands passing through hands. Middlemen upon middlemen, each one inflating the price, each one leaving a trail for the law to follow. The drugs that reached the streets were expensive, diluted, and unreliable. Addicts cursed their suppliers even as they returned to them. And all the while, men in suits, or uniforms those in office towers and police precincts, took their piece. Frank asked himself a simple question. Why tolerate the middle? Why let others control the source of power when he could walk to the source himself? It was a thought that most dismissed as fantasy. The source was Southeast Asia, a place half a world away, drowned in the chaos of war. But Frank saw opportunity in the madness. The Vietnam War had torn jungles into fields of mud and bone. Planes screamed overhead while soldiers trudged below, uncertain if the next step would be their last. Yet hidden among that devastation were the fields of the Golden Triangle, the world's most abundant producers of raw heroin. For Frank, the jungle was not just a theater of blood. It was a marketplace. Where others saw danger, he saw possibility. The trips began quietly, without fanfare. He traveled to Southeast Asia, not as a criminal, but as a man disguised as a businessman, calm and unremarkable. He moved through humid air thick with the smell of gasoline and gunpowder, through cities crowded with fatigues and hollow-eyed boys who had seen too much, too soon. Beneath it all was a rhythm of transactions, American money exchanged for local labor, foreign supplies traded for silence. It was in these fractured spaces that Frank negotiated his future. He cut deals not with whispers on Harlem's corners, but with generals and growers, men who had fields of white poppy stretching across valleys. They were not criminals in their own eyes, but farmers, opportunists, survivors of war. To them, Frank was not a gangster, but a customer, steady and reliable. a man who did not waste words and did not raise his voice. And then came the innovation, the detail so chilling in its efficiency that it seemed almost mythic. Planes flew to Southeast Asia, carrying young men to fight, and those same planes flew back heavy with coffins. The fallen were wrapped, sealed, and sent home to families who grieved. But within some of those coffins, beneath layers of wood and flag, Frank's empire traveled silently across oceans. It was not about desecration in his mind, not about cruelty. It was about invisibility. Who would dare search a soldier's coffin? Who would suspect that grief itself could become a cover for commerce? Frank had not just found a supply chain, he had invented a machine that existed in plain sight while remaining untouchable. Back in Harlem, the difference was immediate. His product was purer, cheaper, and devastatingly consistent. While others diluted, Frank delivered uncut strength. Addicts noticed. Whispers spread. And yet, Frank himself remained hidden, refusing the spotlight that so many of his peers embraced. He did not sit in nightclubs boasting of his fortune. He did not invite cameras to capture his furs or his jewels. Instead, he chose suits that were plain, movements that were minimal, words that were measured. He wanted to be less a man than an idea, presence that was felt but rarely seen. For him, control was not in noise, but in silence. Each dollar collected, each street corner loyal, each rival pushed aside without spectacle, reinforced his belief that true power lay in invisibility. To be overlooked was to be untouchable, and yet the empire was not built only on logistics. It was also a philosophy. Frank demanded discipline from those around him. No recklessness, no unnecessary display. Men who could not follow these rules were dismissed, no matter their loyalty. His organization was not a family in the sentimental sense. It was a machine designed to run cleanly, with each part polished and precise. The contrast was striking. Outside, Harlem pulsed with noise, the jazz spilling from doorways. The arguments shouted across sidewalks, the police whistles slicing through the night. Inside Frank's world, there was stillness, an almost clinical order. Meetings were brief, conversations clipped. He demanded punctuality, precision, obedience. His associates were expected to mirror his invisibility. It was in these quiet details that Frank's empire distinguished itself from the chaos of Harlem. While others were arrested in grand spectacles, paraded before cameras, Frank seemed almost to vanish. He moved like a shadow, only occasionally glimpsed. His power felt in the streets, but his face absent from headlines. The empire he built was not just about heroin. It was about a new way of thinking about bending systems designed for others. About finding silence where others sought noise. About building something vast without ever being seen building it. And yet, beneath this perfection, there lingered a hum. A tension that came from knowing that invisibility could never last forever. Every machine, no matter how finely tuned, eventually reveals a sound, a crack, a glimpse of its moving parts. For now, though, Frank's empire turned quietly in the shadows, its gears invisible, its reach unchallenged. Harlem pulsed above, alive with music and danger, unaware that beneath the rhythm of its nights, a silent empire had already taken root, and Frank, watching it all unfold, must have wondered, was invisibility his shield or the illusion that would one day undo him? Harlem in the late 1960s breathed with contradictions. It was a place of rhythm and brilliance, of music that spilled from dimly lit bars, and laughter that echoed from stoops where families gathered to catch a breeze in the summer heat. Yet beneath this shimmer of resilience lay something else, a slow corrosion, quiet but unrelenting, like rust eating away at steel. Into this fragile balance walked Frank Lucas, and soon the neighborhood would pulse to the rhythm of his empire. By day, Harlem bustled with merchants and children weaving between sidewalks. Vendors sold fruit from wooden crates, and the air carried the scent of roasted peanuts mixed with exhaust fumes from taxis. At night, the mood shifted. Neon lights flickered above club doors, announcing names in glowing letters that promised escape from the hardships of the street. Inside, the music was alive, jazz horns piercing through smoke, voices raised in song and drunken cheer. But between those bright pockets of life, shadows gathered in alleys and corners. They carried whispers, transactions, and promises measured not in hours of labor, but in folded bills exchanged for powder in glassine envelopes. Frank's creation, blue magic, slipped into Harlem like a perfume. At first it was subtle, even alluring. Words spread quietly, a product of unusual purity, untouched by the hands of middlemen who so often diluted and corrupted. Dealers boasted of it. Addicts swore by it. Soon, it wasn't a rumor, but a presence, a current that ran through the veins of the city. It moved faster than any single person could control. Yet at its center was Frank, steady and calculating, holding the strings of an invisible web. Unlike many who came before him, Frank never sought the blinding glare of notoriety. Where others flaunted their riches with gold chains or diamond-studded canes, he carried himself with restraint. His suits were fine, perfectly tailored, but understated. His cars gleamed but never screamed. In a city where arrogance often drew both applause and bullets, Frank's discipline was his shield. He believed in invisibility, in building a fortress not of concrete, but of silence. Yet his presence in Harlem was undeniable. He walked its streets with a confidence that bordered on serenity. Children watched him pass, their eyes wide at the elegance of his clothes, the quiet nods of deference he received from men twice his age. To some, he was an aspiration, proof that someone from these very blocks could master a game designed to crush them. To others, he was a predator, feeding on weakness with the patience of a hunter who never tires. Respect and fear tangled around his name until they became indistinguishable. Harlem, though, bore the cost. The same streets that rang with jazz began to echo with something darker. Families found themselves fractured, not by sudden violence, but by the slow drip of dependency. A mother searching for her son would discover him gaunt, hollow-eyed, his laughter replaced by a quiet tremor. A father who once provided proudly might vanish into alleys, returning home empty-handed, chasing the promise of another high. These were not dramatic explosions, but quiet dissolutions, the kind of unraveling that crept behind closed doors. Frank knew this. Perhaps he told himself it was the price of business, or perhaps he didn't allow himself to dwell on it at all. His discipline demanded compartmentalization. To him, Harlem was both stage and market, its suffering merely another factor in an equation of power. In interviews years later, he would describe himself as a businessman, no different from those who wore suits and carried briefcases downtown. But the math of his empire was written not in ledgers alone, but in the silent erosion of thousands of lives. The paradox deepened. Harlem glittered with wealth that seemed to bloom suddenly from nowhere. Nightclubs thrived, champagne bottles popped, cars lined the curbs with chrome shining like mirrors. Some families, connected to the trade, found themselves lifted above the hunger that had once haunted them. Money flowed, and with it came a fragile illusion of prosperity. Yet just as quickly, that wealth revealed its cost. For every man who strutted in new shoes, another stumbled in rags. For every smile in the clubs, there were tears in the apartments above. Frank remained unmoved by the paradox. Where others might have been consumed by guilt or flamboyance, he returned always to his principle, control. His empire was not simply about selling heroin, but about designing a machine. Each gear was hidden, each cog turned silently. Couriers carried packages through the night. Dealers whispered names and sums behind locked doors. Police officers, bribed with careful precision, looked away at just the right moments. The entire system moved without sound, like a clock whose hands advanced but never ticked. Harlem did not see the blueprint, only the consequences. Still, Frank could not be entirely invisible. Rumors traveled like smoke, curling into corners where even silence could not hold them back. His name became a kind of myth, spoken in tones both admiring and fearful. Children, too young to grasp the truth, repeated his name as though it belonged to a legend. Elders, wiser, shook their heads, knowing how legends often ended. Harlem itself seemed caught in a state of hypnosis. The music still played, the clubs still glittered, and on the surface, life continued. But there was a weight in the air, a heaviness that pressed against the neighborhood. The shadow of blue magic stretched further with each passing week, creeping not with sudden violence, but with inevitability. In this atmosphere, Frank thrived. His calm demeanor made him appear almost untouchable, as if chaos itself bent to his discipline. Yet discipline has its own cost. It isolates, it calcifies, it draws walls around the man who practices it. Frank's wealth grew, his reach expanded, but so too did the distance between him and the world he had once walked as just another son of Harlem. The streets that had raised him now bowed to him, yet they did so under a cloud of devastation. By the end of the decade, Harlem was no longer merely a neighborhood. It was a stage where Frank Lucas had written his name in both gold and ash. The paradox of his empire, provider and predator. Elegance and destruction defined not only his legacy, but the lives of thousands who never chose to be part of his story. And so Harlem stood, caught between survival and collapse. Its music still echoing, its lights still glowing, but its foundation trembling beneath the quiet grip of one man's ambition. The chapter of Harlem in Frank's grip does not end with violence or fanfare. It lingers like a low note played on a saxophone, haunting and unresolved, leaving the listener to wonder what happens when a man's discipline becomes the very shadow that consumes his own people. For years, Frank Lucas had perfected the art of invisibility. He built his empire not with fireworks, but with silence. No drunken displays of wealth, no photographs flaunting gold chains, no neon signs that pointed to his door. Harlem streets were crowded with men who longed to be seen, men who wanted their names whispered in smoky back rooms or shouted over jazz trumpets. Frank was different. He believed that power lived in the shadows, not in the spotlight. And for a time, this philosophy kept him untouchable. But power has a way of attracting light. No matter how carefully it hides, it cannot remain invisible forever. The greater the empire grows, the louder its heartbeat becomes. The unraveling began with something deceptively small, a gift offered in love, but received in pride. A fur coat, chinchilla, thick and gleaming, with a matching hat. It was the sort of garment designed to be noticed, a garment that transformed the quiet man into a spectacle. Frank wore it one evening to a heavyweight boxing match in Madison Square Garden. He had front row seats, close enough to feel the sweat fly from the fighters' bodies, close enough to be captured by the cameras in that moment. Without meaning to, Frank stepped into the light. His photograph, draped in fur and flanked by elegance, stood out more sharply than the fighters in the ring. And in the eyes of law enforcement, a question began to form. Who is this man? The noose did not tighten overnight. It pulled slowly, almost invisibly, like a rope dragged across a floor until the skin beneath it begins to burn. Detectives and federal agents had long known Harlem's crime bosses, the loud ones, the reckless ones. But Frank was a mystery. No records of flamboyant arrests, no tax trails leading to luxury mansions. Yet there he was, occupying the most expensive seats in the garden, dressed like royalty. Men of power, true power, rarely go unnoticed for long. Behind the scenes, rival whispers fed the growing fire. Competitors whose businesses had withered under Frank's disciplined operation saw opportunity in his newfound visibility. Envy breeds betrayal, and betrayal feeds law enforcement. Names were passed along, locations, shipments, even fragments of rumor. Each thread was small, but together they began to weave the outline of a man who had seemed until then untouchable. Frank felt the shift. He noticed it in the way conversations paused when he entered a room. He sensed it in the sudden caution of his associates, in the questions that lingered too long, in the silence that followed his answers. Harlem, once a stage for his quiet triumph, was beginning to turn against him. The same streets that had carried his empire now carried the weight of suspicion. The authorities too were changing. The 70s brought a new hunger for accountability, at least in public. Political pressure demanded results, demanded that someone, anyone, be held responsible for the drugs that bled into American cities. Narcotics squads formed like hunting packs. Some were earnest, chasing the trail with determination. Others were corrupt, seeking only to carve out a share of the spoils. In New York, corruption ran deep, and Frank had long understood the necessity of paying for silence. But silence was becoming expensive, and worse, it was becoming unreliable. Still, Frank clung to his discipline. He reminded himself that he had built this empire not by accident, but by design. Pride, however, is a quiet disease. It enters slowly, disguised as confidence, and only reveals its damage once it has spread too far. That fur coat, the one he would later claim was a mistake, a moment of weakness, became more than fabric. It was a symbol, not just for others, but for Frank himself. It marked the point where invisibility gave way to presence, where restraint bent under the weight of vanity. The investigations grew, layer by layer, like dust collecting in the corners of a locked room. The federal government began to notice the streams of heroin arriving in Harlem, streams so pure and profitable that they defied the normal channels of supply. Rumors reached them of soldiers returning from Vietnam with connections, of shipments hidden in caskets, of a network too sophisticated to belong to the flashy street hustlers they knew. They began to circle in tighter arcs, convinced that someone at the center was orchestrating it all. Frank, meanwhile, found himself caught in the paradox of his own making. He had built a business on trust, discipline, and secrecy. But the larger the business became, the more fragile those pillars grew. Associates who once revered his control now resented his caution. Rivals saw openings in his methods, and the police, always circling, were beginning to find cracks. At night, Harlem no longer felt like home. The glittering clubs where jazz once played now carried an undertone of menace. Every knock at the door seemed louder. Every shadow stretched longer. The streets themselves seemed to whisper a warning, as though the very concrete beneath Frank's feet knew what was coming. Inside him, too, a tension began to grow. The man who prided himself on calm calculation felt the first stirrings of paranoia. He checked his rearview mirror too often. He questioned the loyalty of men he had once trusted with his life. He wondered if discipline was enough, or if discipline itself had betrayed him, for by refusing to embrace the spectacle for so long, had he made his sudden display even more glaring. The fall was not yet complete. The empire still stood, vast and profitable, but its foundations were weakening. A photograph at a boxing match, a whisper in a back room, a detective's curiosity piqued by a man who should not have been there, dressed in garments that spoke too loudly. These were not catastrophes on their own, but together they formed the first cracks in a dam that could no longer hold. Frank Lucas, the invisible king of Harlem, had stepped, however briefly, into the light. And once seen, he could not be unseen. The noose was tightening, slowly, methodically, inch by inch, and deep down, Frank must have known that it would never loosen again. There is a silence that comes before betrayal, not the quiet of peace, but something heavier, a silence that feels like the air itself is listening, waiting. For Frank, it began in fragments. A look held too long, a conversation that ended when he entered the room. The faint shift of shadows where once there had been only light. It was not one betrayal, but many. Some from men who had eaten at his table. Some from strangers he would never know. And finally, the most piercing of all, the betrayal that came from within himself. For years he had built his empire on rules that seemed unbreakable. Do not draw attention. Do not grow greedy. Do not allow outsiders in. Each of these commandments had been etched into his life like scripture. And yet, like scripture, they were open to interpretation, and eventually to defiance. His empire had not fallen in one swift collapse. It had begun with hairline cracks, whispers, suspicions, small tremors beneath the surface that he had ignored, because to acknowledge them would have been to face his own fragility. In Harlem, the air had changed. What once felt like an endless carnival of lights and music had dimmed into something colder. The clubs that once hummed with laughter now carried an undercurrent of fear. Men who once greeted him with warmth began to speak in measured tones. He noticed the way their eyes drifted away, as though they were calculating something just beyond his reach. There were questions in those eyes, and questions were dangerous. The law was circling closer, and Frank knew it. Courtrooms filled with men whose names he recognized, some who had sworn loyalty, now standing before judges with bowed heads, trading words for mercy. Interrogation rooms became stages for betrayal, lit by the pale buzz of fluorescent bulbs. It was there, under the relentless ticking of clocks and the quiet menace of investigators, that silence itself became a weapon. Those who kept it clung to dignity. Those who broke it traded dignity for survival. Frank had always prided himself on silence. He once believed it was the strongest armor a man could wear. But silence is heavy. It bends under the weight of fear. And in the end, silence can cut both ways, protecting one man while damning another. When the pressure mounted, Frank stood at the edge of a choice he had sworn never to make: to cooperate, to speak, to offer up pieces of the very world he had helped weave in shadows. He told himself it was strategy, not weakness, that his words could be measured, directed like a blade, cutting away the parts of the system that no longer served him. But the truth was less elegant. Beneath the veneer of calculation, there was fear. Fear of the walls closing in. Fear of vanishing into a cell, forgotten, while others thrived on his ruin in the mirror. He could no longer see the man he once was. The man who wore discipline like armor, who walked through Harlem streets with the certainty of a king. Instead, he saw a face lined with exhaustion, eyes clouded with paranoia, a mouth that whispered bargains to strangers in government buildings. Each reflection brought with it the knowledge that the betrayal had not begun in the mouths of his rivals, nor in the signatures of his enemies. It had begun in him, in the quiet concession that survival mattered more than silence. The tragedy of Frank's downfall was not only that he betrayed others, but that he betrayed the very idea of himself. For years, he had lived by codes that promised him invincibility. But when the storm came, those codes became fragile glass, shattering at the first strike of desperation. His associates saw it. His enemies saw it. Even the city itself seemed to recognize it. Harlem, once his kingdom, now turned its face away, as if ashamed to have been ruled by a man who could not endure his own silence. The networks of corruption he exposed were not minor threads, but deep roots stretching into politics, police precincts, and halls of power where the names were never spoken aloud. He became a scalpel in the hands of the very system he had spent a lifetime outmaneuvering. Each confession unraveled another layer of protection, another veil pulled away. What was once invisible was now exposed under the harsh light of inquiry, and there was no way back into the shadows. And yet, it was not victory for the law. It was tragedy. A man once revered for his cunning had become his own undoing. He stood in courtrooms where he might once have commanded awe, now only another figure in a suit, offering words that tasted of ash. Each revelation cut deeper into his own legacy, until even he could not tell where loyalty ended and betrayal began. The sound of betrayal is not always a shout or a cry. Sometimes it is quieter, the scratch of a pen signing testimony, the click of a recorder, the closing of a file, each small sound, insignificant on its own, together became the funeral hymn for the empire Frank had built. When he looked back, he could not trace the moment where everything had shifted. Was it the day he wore the fur coat, letting the cameras capture a man who had sworn to remain unseen? Was it in the glances exchanged by his partners, the unspoken realization that their survival outweighed their loyalty? Or was it simply in his own heart, the first time he allowed pride to outweigh patience? These questions haunted him because no answer could absolve him, and so he stood, betrayed by others, betrayed by himself, watching as the world he had crafted unraveled thread by thread. The silence that once shielded him had become a void that consumed him. He had lived by rules, but he would be remembered by the breaking of them. In the end, betrayal is not an explosion. It is an echo, a sound that lingers long after the moment has passed, haunting the corridors of memory. For Frank, that echo was the mirror, reflecting not the king he imagined himself to be, but the man who had given it all away. And as he stared into that reflection, the city around him shifted once more. Harlem, with its fading glamour and rising tension, was no longer his stage. The audience had turned away. The story had moved on. All that remained was the echo of betrayal and the hollow certainty that once it begins, it never truly ends. The nights inside prison are unlike any other kind of night. They are not dark in the way the streets of Harlem were dark, thick with smoke and laughter, pulsing with neon lights and whispered deals in dim corners. No, prison nights are pale, washed out, humming with the faint buzz of fluorescent lights that never truly turn off. They stretch on endlessly, one bleeding into the next, as though time itself has stopped caring about where the hours begin or end. For Frank, this silence was the harshest punishment of all. He had lived his life surrounded by sound, the shuffle of cards in back rooms, the hum of jazz drifting out of Harlem bars, the confident rhythm of his own voice closing deals, commanding loyalty. Now there was only stillness, a stillness so deep that he could hear the faint scrape of his own breath echoing against the concrete walls, the faint click of metal doors closing in corridors far away, the distant cough of another inmate in another cell. He had once commanded empires, money, influence, entire neighborhoods bent under the weight of his decisions. He had been a man people looked at with a mixture of fear and respect. Yet here, inside these walls, Frank was reduced to something smaller, stripped of his suits, his name, his freedom, reduced to a number, to a shadow of what he had once been. The days passed with a slowness that could almost drive a man mad. Morning came with the clank of metal trays, the smell of lukewarm coffee, the same grey oatmeal that slid across the tongue without taste. Afternoons blurred into evenings, marked only by the shift change of guards and the occasional muffled argument down the corridor. The sameness was crushing, pressing down on him until he could barely distinguish one week from another dot. Yet, within that silence, Frank discovered a strange kind of reckoning. For the first time in years, there were no distractions, no urgent deals to negotiate, no danger to anticipate. Only his own thoughts, circling endlessly, demanding his attention. He thought about Harlem, about the neon nights, about the laughter that once surrounded him. He thought about the faces of men who had stood beside him, and of those who had betrayed him. And most of all, he thought about himself, about the choices he had made, and the life he had built on foundations of shadow and secrecy. Some nights he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, and remember the rhythm of the city outside his cell, the sound of subway trains rattling beneath the streets, the horns of taxis impatient at red lights, the music that spilled from doorways into the night air. Those sounds were gone now, swallowed by the thick silence of prison. And in their absence, Frank found himself wondering if those years of power had been worth the cost. There were moments, too, of anger, of bitterness, the knowledge that men in suits, men who had shared his profits and shaken his hand, now walked free while he carried the burden of their secrets behind bars. The betrayal gnawed at him, sharp as broken glass. Yet even in his anger, there was no outlet, no audience. The cell walls absorbed his fury, his voice swallowed before it could even rise. Time became both enemy and companion. Days stacked upon days, forming months, then years. Seasons passed, but Frank saw them only in fragments. A slant of sunlight across the prison yard in summer, the bitter chill of wind seeping through cracks in winter. He aged within those walls, the sharpness of his features softening, his once confident stride slowed by the weight of confinement. Mirrors reflected a man older, more fragile, but still carrying the trace of the cunning that had once defined him. He was neither monster nor martyr, though some outside these walls might have painted him as one or the other. He was, in truth, a man with ambitions, with flaws, with regrets, a man who had risen high and fallen hard. And now, in the silence of the cell, he was simply left with himself. No illusions, no excuses, only the raw truth of his existence. Letters would arrive sometimes from distant acquaintances or curious admirers who still whispered his name in fascination. He would unfold them slowly, tracing the words with eyes that had grown weary of blank walls. They spoke of a world that had moved on without him. Harlem had changed. The clubs, the music, the street corners, all had shifted into something unrecognizable. His empire had dissolved, scattered into dust. What had once been his legacy was now only memory, spoken of in half-forgotten stories and fading gossip. And perhaps that was the hardest truth of all, that the world does not stop for any man, not even one who had once commanded so much of it. The silence in the cell was not only the silence of prison, it was the silence of being left behind, of watching the tide of history wash away footprints once thought permanent. Frank would sit sometimes in the narrow beam of light that crept through the barred window and close his eyes. In that light, he could almost imagine himself elsewhere, walking again through the crowded streets, hearing again the pulse of music and laughter. But when he opened his eyes, there was only the cell, only the stillness, and yet, within that silence, there was also a kind of peace. For the first time, there were no enemies waiting outside the door, no schemes to unravel, no betrayals to anticipate. The world could no longer touch him. In its place, there was only the slow passage of time, the soft rhythm of breath, the steady beat of his heart, reminding him that he still lived. Even here, silence became both his punishment and his refuge, a mirror in which he could see himself, not as others had seen him, but as he truly was, flawed, ambitious, human. And as the years passed, Frank learned to live within that silence, not to escape it, not to fight it, but to let it seep into him like water through stone, until the man who had once commanded Harlem was no longer a figure of legend, but simply a man, waiting for the silence to end, or perhaps to become eternal. He walked out of the prison gates with a body that no longer belonged to the man who had once ruled Harlem. The stride that had once commanded attention was slower now, tempered by years of confinement. His hair, once neat and sharp, was streaked with grey. His hands, once accustomed to gripping the wheel of expensive cars and the leather of tailored coats, trembled ever so slightly as they reached for freedom. Frank Lucas was no longer the kingpin, no longer the myth whispered on street corners or sung about in coded verses. He was a man returning to a world that had kept moving without him. Harlem greeted him not with a roar, but with a silence so heavy it felt unfamiliar. The neighborhood was alive, yes, taxis blaring their horns, children chasing one another on cracked sidewalks, the thump of bass spilling from passing cars. But beneath it all was an absence. The Harlem he had left behind in the 1970s was gone. The swagger of the streets had shifted. The landmarks of his reign had either been demolished, boarded up, or transformed into something unrecognizable. Time had not paused for him, and as he took his first hesitant steps through those avenues, he realized Harlem itself had changed clothes. Gone were the nights when jazz spilled from club doors like warm light. Gone was the sense that every block carried both danger and glamour in equal measure. The heroin era had bled Harlem dry, leaving scars etched into the faces of families who had survived its grasp. Whole buildings seemed to sag under the weight of what they had witnessed. Apartments that had once sheltered working class pride now stood hollow-eyed, their bricks stained and weary. For Frank, every corner was an echo, every shadow a memory returning to haunt him. He turned down 116th Street, a place that once pulsed with ambition and deal-making. Once, this was his office without walls, where nods and whispers could move fortunes. Now it was just another stretch of cracked pavement. The people who passed by didn't glance at him with fear or respect. They didn't recognize him at all. He was a ghost wandering through the ruins of his own empire, but Harlem itself was still alive. Its rhythms had shifted, but the heartbeat remained. New music now poured from speakers, rap verses woven with anger and pride. The voice of a new generation narrating the very streets he had once claimed. In the flow of those lyrics, he heard fragments of his own story refracted into myth. His name was still out there, but no longer tethered to the man himself. It had become legend, stripped of its flesh and blood. He was no longer Frank Lucas, the man. He was Frank Lucas, the symbol. As he walked deeper, memory overlapped with reality. He saw faces he knew, though many were long gone. He remembered the way the air had once smelled of frying food from corner vendors, mingling with the sharp temps of diesel and the sweet, dangerous aroma of money being counted in hidden rooms. Now, that same air carried exhaustion, resilience, and a city that had learned to survive betrayal. Harlem had endured his reign, endured the devastation of drugs, endured the endless cycle of kings rising and falling. It had endured him. The elegy of Harlem was not only about what was lost, but also about what refused to die. In the laughter of children kicking a ball across the street, there was resistance. In the church choirs that still sang with voices lifted to heaven, there was survival. In the murals painted on brick walls, memorializing lives taken too soon, there was memory. Harlem carried scars, yes, but it also carried an unbroken will. Frank found himself lingering near old haunts, staring at buildings that had once been part of his kingdom. A brownstone here, a storefront there. Each one had stories etched into its walls. Deals struck, debts settled, dreams destroyed. He thought of the men who had stood beside him, sharp suits and cold eyes, all of them long since gone to prison cells or graves. He thought of the women who had laughed in silk dresses under the glow of chandeliers, their beauty faded into photographs tucked away in forgotten drawers. He thought of his own family, torn apart and stitched back together, their lives forever bound to his choices. And yet, in the midst of all that, he was just an old man walking streets that had once trembled under his command. There was no empire waiting for him, no throne, no subjects, only echoes. The echoes came in whispers, shopkeepers recalling the years when cash flowed freely, mothers remembering children lost to the poison he once controlled, men on corners repeating stories about the time Harlem had its king. Each story was a shard of truth wrapped in myth. Some remembered him as a monster, others as a provider, a Robin Hood in expensive coats. But none of those stories felt like him now. They belonged to a man he could barely recognize. What struck him most was not the disdain, nor even the absence of fear. It was the indifference. Harlem had moved on. The world had turned. His name was history, his presence irrelevant. In that realization, there was both sorrow and strange relief. The burden of his crown had dissolved. He stood one evening on the corner of 125th Street as dusk settled, the neon lights buzzing to life above storefronts. He watched the traffic inch along, watched people carrying groceries, watched lovers arguing in hushed tones. Life went on. Harlem lived. It had been scarred by him, scarred by many, but it had not died. And in that moment, he understood something that years in prison had not taught him. An empire built on ruin cannot last, but a community, even broken and battered, carries on. Harlem had been more than his kingdom. It was a living, breathing organism, a tapestry woven of resilience and suffering, beauty and despair. He had once tried to bend it to his will, but Harlem had survived him. Harlem always survived. As the evening deepened and shadows stretched across the pavement, Frank began to walk again, not as a king returning to claim his land, but as a man searching for his place in the echoes. Every footstep seemed to dissolve into memory, into the soft hum of a city that no longer belonged to him. The echoes of Harlem lingered, soft and haunting, reminding him that while his empire was gone, the streets remained. They carried the brilliance of music, the weight of tragedy, and the quiet resilience of people who refused to be broken. Harlem was not his story anymore. It never truly had been. And so, he walked on a figure swallowed by the city, a man erased by time, leaving behind only whispers of the world he once thought he owned. There is a strange silence that follows the fall of an empire. It is not the silence of peace, nor of order restored. It is the silence of something unresolved, lingering like smoke that refuses to clear. Frank Lucas's story belongs to this silence. For decades, his name has moved like a shadow through American memory, part myth, part cautionary tale, part whispered legend from the days when Harlem pulsed with jazz and heroin in equal measure. He has been cast as a mastermind and a monster, as a disciplined strategist and a ruthless dealer, as a man who built an empire with patience and tore it down with pride. But the truth of Frank Lucas does not sit comfortably in any single frame. His life resists simplification, like a story written in ink that bleeds across the page, leaving no clean borders between right and wrong, brilliance and destruction. He was a man who believed in rules, even as he broke the most sacred ones. He was admired for his discipline, for his ability to stand apart from the chaos of the streets and run them as though they were a business. Yet he was condemned for the ruin that discipline produced, the thousands of lives undone by his heroin, the families broken, the futures erased. He built a fortune out of devastation, and though he spent it in velvet suits and quiet mansions, its weight never left him. Frank Lucas was both architect and ruin of his own fate. His empire was built on innovation, a supply line that bypassed every middleman, a vision that turned narcotics into a global commodity, and yet it was destroyed by the very traits that had made him powerful: pride, defiance, and an unshakable belief that he could outlast the world that had birthed him. As his years wound down, the world moved on. Harlem changed, its rhythms shifting, its skyline reshaped by towers of glass and steel. The old corners where soldiers once stood, where whispers of blue magic carried through the night, became just another part of the city's long history of reinvention. The neighborhoods did not forget, not entirely, but they learned to fold the memory into the larger story of survival. The heroin era left scars, deep and visible, but even scars fade into the larger shape of the body that carries them. And yet, if you walk through Harlem today, there are moments when the past presses close. A flicker of neon from an old sign, a melody of jazz spilling out of a bar, a shadow moving quickly across a dimly lit street. These fragments carry echoes, not of empire, but of the contradictions that defined it. For Harlem was not only wounded by Frank Lucas's ambition, it was also the stage upon which his brilliance, his audacity, and his tragedy played out. Legacy is never as simple as the deeds it records. It is not a monument, not a statue carved in stone to tell future generations who a man was. It is something quieter, more elusive. It is the way his choices ripple through time, the way his name lingers in a half-remembered conversation, the way his story becomes a mirror for others searching for meaning in the struggle between power and consequence. Frank's legacy does not live in marble halls or gilded plaques. It lives in systems he learned to bend, in the silences he knew how to wield, in the paradoxes he embodied without apology. He was both feared and respected, despised and envied. His fall was celebrated by some and mourned by others. And still, decades later, his name continues to haunt the margins of history, too infamous to ignore, too complicated to define. What remains, then, is a question. A question whispered in the same streets where his empire once thrived. What does it mean to win, if winning leaves only ruins behind? For Frank, victory was measured in wealth, in territory, in the iron grip he held over a city. But the cost was measured in lives, countless lives, lost to the poison he delivered with ruthless efficiency. Was it worth it? The silence that follows his story refuses to answer. Perhaps that is what makes his tale endure. Not its lessons, nor its warnings, but its refusal to resolve. Frank Lucas is remembered not because he was right or wrong, but because he was both a man who rose from nothing to build a fortune beyond imagination, and who fell back into nothing with the weight of his empire crushing down upon him. In the end, there is no neat conclusion, only images. The image of Harlem at night, neon lights flickering like tired stars above the streets. The image of a man sitting in a quiet room, staring at the city he once ruled, wondering if the ghosts of his past still walked those sidewalks. The image of shadows stretching long across the pavement, as if carrying the weight of a story too heavy to be forgotten, too complex to be told in simple terms. This is where Frank Lucas remains, in the echoes, in the shadows, in the paradox that outlives him. His empire is gone, his wealth dissipated, his power extinguished, but his story lingers, moving quietly through Harlem like a whisper in the dark dot as we close this chapter. The sound is not of finality, but of reflection. The music does not end abruptly. It fades, note by note, until silence carries it away. And in that silence, his legacy breathes, uncertain, unresolved, yet unforgettable. Frank Lucas's life was not a cautionary tale, nor a celebration. It was a reminder that ambition, when unmoored from conscience, can build palaces of glass that shatter at the first strike. It was proof that power, once seized, never truly belongs to the one who holds it. It belongs to the streets, to the people, to the history that remembers. And so, the story ends not with a verdict, but with a shadow stretching across Harlem, across history, across the memory of a man who tried to master both. A shadow that reminds us that every empire, no matter how vast, eventually dissolves into whispers. Frank Lucas is gone, but the streets remember, *, and in their remembering, his legacy endures.